Good afternoon, book lovers. This is Robert Boyd coming at you. And what you were listening to just now was the Monotone Symphony by Yves Klein. Yves Klein was a French artist, and this was a composition that he played along with a performance, which I'll discuss in a moment. My book today is this one, Yves the Provocateur, by Thomas McEvilley. McEvilley was a critic and a professor and a scholar who taught at Rice University, of which I'm a alumnus, and I took a couple of classes from him. He died in 2013, I think of pancreatic cancer. And I've read most of his books of criticism. I think there might be one or two that I haven't gotten yet, but this one was sitting on my shelf for a long time. I didn't read it because I wasn't a big fan of Yves Klein, and I'm still not in love with Yves Klein, but it was a very interesting book. He writes in the introduction of it that he was invited to dinner by Dominique de Menil, famous Schlumberger heiress here in Houston, and founder of the Menil Museum. And she was a great collector and an art lover, and he had never written art history or art criticism at that point, and this was 1977. But he had been hired by the university, I think at her urging, to teach art history. I'm not really sure how that happened because he wasn't an art historian. Anyway, he goes over to her house for dinner, and they talk about this and that, including Yves Klein, because she had a painting of his and hanging on the wall. And I guess he impressed her, and he was a very impressive, learned person when he talked. And so she asked him, well, if you could curate an exhibit of any kind, what would you do? And he said, well, Yves Klein would be interesting. And so she said, okay, let's do it. And they did an exhibition of Klein at the Rice University Museum, which is not a really big, impressive museum. It was really it was a corrugated building on the edge of campus that the Menils paid for. And he did all the research and went to France, went to Klein's archives there and dove into them. Met all Klein's compatriots and friends and his wife, his widow, and did an amazing amount of research. And I think at that time he did this, which was in 1982, which when the exhibit was put on. He really found some original material about Klein. I don't think it was recognized how much Klein was influenced by Rosicrucianism, which is a quasi-religion. It's been around, I guess, more or less since the Middle Ages, but it was revived in the late 19th century and early 20th century, largely by a guy named Max Heimdal, a Danish American mystic and writer. He was born in Denmark and wrote a book about Rosicrucianism that was published in 1919. I take that back. It was published in 1909 and then died in 1919 in Oceanside, California, where the Rosicrucian Society continued to exist for a long time. As far all I know, it still exists there. And the book that he wrote that Klein read was Le Cosmogony de Rose-Croix. And I'm sure it was actually written in Danish or maybe in English. I'm not sure. But in any case, Klein read it in French. And he was reading it as a teenager. And everything he did after that, all his art was based on the things he read in that book. But by the time McEvely came along, I think the Rosicrucian aspect of his work was kind of not that well known. And McEvely, his background was as a philologist, a classical philologist. He studied classics in Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, and did philology on them. He examined the text for things that were related to previous texts, essentially. And he did the same thing with Klein's writing, and he was kind of proud of it. You can tell, because he in one essay here he writes about how he was the first person to do philology on Klein's text, and that's how he came to realize that Klein was deeply indebted to Heimdall's book. Now, in addition to the text on Rosicrucianism, he also wrote a really lengthy biography of the man. And it should be noted, this book, even though it appears like it's a book by itself, it really is the catalog for this exhibit, with all the art taken out and all the text left in, and a new introduction written. So basically, the catalog was created in 1982, and this book was published, let's see, hold on, sorry. Was published in 2010, so I think he wanted, and the catalog is extremely valuable if you go looking for it online. I think he wanted to create I think when he did his books, he was always like collecting work that had been published elsewhere. And in this case, all his work for that catalog by itself was effectively a whole nother book. All he added was the introduction about meeting Dominic de Menil and being assigned to put together this exhibit, which was not only went up at Rice, but went all around the world to major museums in different cities. So that really put him on the map as an art historian / critic. He interviewed people like Armand, who was an artist. I think he's dead now, but I'm not sure. If he's still alive, he's quite old. Jean Tinguely, the sculptor of really amusing mechanical things, and Klein's widow, and I'm going to just guess on the pronunciation here, Rotrot Klein. In any case, let me launch into a biography of Klein, because he was born in 1928. Both of his parents were artists, and in a way I think that influenced his becoming an artist a lot, even though he didn't really have any what we would normally consider artistic talent, but he had ideas. And in that way, he becomes one of the precursors to conceptual art. He was terrible at school. In 1944, he attempted to join the resistance, but he was like 16 years old. But it was too late, because by that time, the Normandy invasion had taken place, and the Allies had liberated Paris, and there's nothing left to do for the resistance except to mop up. But a story that McEvely tells us that he brought a hand grenade home to their apartment in Paris, which alarmed his mother, and so she gingerly took it to the army to turn it in. He had kind of childish taste, even as an adult. As a child, he was a big fan of Tintin and remained a fan apparently into adulthood. Mandrake the Magician, the comic strip, and also of tales of medieval knights and chivalry and that kind of stuff. In 1947, he started studying judo in Nice, and he was a dedicated judoka. He met Claude Pascal and Armand Fernandez, who is later changes his name to Armand when he becomes an artist. And the three of them together begin studying Rosicrucianism. And Rosicrucianism comes off, to me at least, as monkey shines. It definitely feels like one of these weird-ass religions that starts in the 19th century and continues to the 20th. Things like spiritualism, Madame Blavatsky, all those guys. All that stuff just seems so absurd to me. But it meant something really powerful to Klein, and he read the book over and over again, had it practically memorized. He continues studying judo. He gets really good at it. He moves to Madrid for a while in 51 to study there, but then he ends up teaching there. Moves back to Paris in 52. Teaches judo there, and has his first public exhibit, monochromes of various colors. That was his thing. He believed in color, and all of this comes from Rosicrucianism, over line. He thought there was a battle between line and color. And consequently, he was a big fan of Delacroix as opposed to Ang, where the battle between line and color was fought in the 19th century. He is serious about judo, and he ends up moving to Japan in 1952 and living there to 1953, and getting his fourth degree belt in judo. So he's certainly one of the few people in France who progresses that high in the judo hierarchy. But in 1954, when he comes back, the French Judo Foundation rejects his diploma from the Japanese school. For what reason, who knows? And the thing is, he was really ambitious with his judo. He planned to be the leader of judo in France, which seems like a strange goal, but he's good at it, and he's a great teacher apparently, and obviously a highly skilled judoka. But they kind of cut him off at the knees, and he decides at that point, well, I guess I'll be an artist. In 1954, he's made a Knight of Saint Sebastian, which is a religious order, but it seems like the main reason he did it is because he wanted to be a knight. In 1957, he starts exhibiting blue monochromes. Blue in Rosicrucianism is a really powerful color. The blue void is a powerful symbol in Rosicrucianism. In 1958, he does his first anthropometry. Anthropometry? I'm not sure how you pronounce it. But basically what he would do is he'd hire models to slather themselves in paint and make body impressions on a canvas that's laid on the floor. And that's what, it was one of those paintings that Thomas McEvilley saw at Dominique de Menil's house. And in fact, one of them is still owned by the Menil Museum. They own a pretty good selection of Yves Klein paintings and sculptures. He believes that everything art should be dematerialized, and in 1959 he starts selling zones of immaterial pictorial sensibility, which are non-existent paintings. He gets paid in gold because the alchemical associations with gold are important to him because of Rosicrucianism, and he gives the recipient a certificate, and then he throws the gold into the Seine. Um, Obviously, not a good way to make a lot of money, but apparently he sells a few of these. Um, he realizes that Rosicrucianism is just not gonna fly in the French art world. So he's reading a French philosopher named Gaston Bachelard, a phenomenologist, a very highly regarded, serious philosopher, and he claims that Bachelard's ideas support his art, and Bachelard's ideas, at least the bits that Klein read, do seem similar to what he was doing. Um, but there's a funny story about Bachelard, which I'll get to in a minute. He performs his in 1960. He patents International Klein Blue. I'm wearing this ultramarine blue shirt as a tribute to Mr. Klein. And if you see his paintings, it's a super intense blue that he uses. And also in 1960, he performs the monotone symphony while creating uh, an anthropometry painting. And the symphony is one chord, which seems appropriate for someone who is painting paintings with one color. It was composed in 1949, but I don't think he actually had the wherewithal to put on a full symphony with it. In 1961, he exhibits at the Leo Castelli Gallery in New York, and that show was not well received by Americans. They thought he was kind of a goof. They thought it was neo-Dada, which in a way it was. But then he shows at the Dwan Gallery in Los Angeles, which was one of the most progressive galleries in L.A., and the artists in L.A. embrace him. They like him. And also in 1961, he finally visits Bachelard, and he suggests to Bachelard that he's a crypto-Rosicrucian, and Bachelard, who's a serious philosopher, kicks him out. He says, "Dude, I am not that nutty religious nonsense." In 1962, he finally marries Rotrot, but he dies of heart failure. He's really young. He's only 34. And this book really, mainly, the main text is this biography, and Machiavelli dives into the work critically, but always connecting it to Rosicrucianism. And Machiavelli is funny because if you read his later works, and I've read a lot of his books, which are basically collections of essays that he wrote for various art magazines like Art Forum and so on, he doesn't have a lot of time for the mystical in painting. He doesn't really like things like Kazimir Malevich, for example. He likes art with a more skeptical attitude. He liked Duchamp. And so the weird thing about Klein is Klein's on one hand kind of a Dadaist because he's jokey. His artwork and his whole presentation is kind of jokey. But he is very serious about the mystical aspects of his monochromatic paintings, about the color blue, about immaterial paintings, about architecture in the air. And he's also serious about aspects of Rosicrucianism that don't really have an analog in the real world, like levitation. And there's a famous photograph of Klein where he's leapt out of a window. The artist leaps into the void, and he produced this as a newspaper, a 4-page newspaper filled with his writings that he basically gave out like 20,000 copies. He basically put them on Paris newsstands and gave them for free. I wonder if they're rare. People have them now. I guess they do. But in any case, he was dead serious about literally flying into the void, because he saw it as part of the next evolution of man. If once everyone embraced Rosicrucianism. Anyway, he died early, and I think, and he was part of a French art movement, of whom Armand was a major part, and Tingley, and actually a whole bunch of other people, called the Nouveau Realist. That term was coined by a French critic who was also a friend of Klein, named Pierre Restany, and although Restany and Klein had a falling out because Restany suggested that Klein's work was neo-Dada, and Klein didn't want to be associated with Dada, which he saw as unserious. But these artists were some of the best French artists of their time, and they carried the torch for Klein after his death, and Klein is now written into art history, a major figure. So, I have a couple of stories to tell that are related to Klein, but not specifically about Klein or this book. In 1989, I was living in Seattle, and my favorite art space there was the Center on Contemporary Art, known also as COCA. And the director of it at the time was a guy named Larry Reed. And in '89, they put on a show of artists basically recreating famous pieces of art, curated by Charles Kraft, who died recently, and before he died went totally insane. But no one thought he was insane yet in 1989, and the show was amusing, and definitely had sort of a feeling of all those artists from the 80s who would recreate artworks like Sherry Levine and Sturdivant. And in fact, they hired one of the best appropriationists, our best known, Mark Bidlow, to come do a performance. And Mark Bidlow's performance was to recreate an anthropometry. So basically, they had a bunch of naked ladies from the Lusty Lady nude club, which was next door to Coca, in downtown Seattle, who coated themselves with paint and made body impressions, while a string quartet played the monotone symphony in the background. And Bidlow was dressed in a tuxedo and directed them the same way that Klein directed his female performers in his anthropometries. And I remember after the performance, sitting around talking with Larry and Bidlow and a few other people, and outside the door, Seattle's own version of the Guerrilla Girls was protesting the performance. And why not? It was a totally sexist performance. And Bidlow was kind of scared to go out. He was scared of them. I remember being quite amused by what a chicken shit he was. Anyway, going forward many years from then, one of my friends here in Houston, an artist who's a few years older than I am, Nestor Topchi, was heavily influenced by Klein. A lot of his works are basically painted Klein blue, IKB, and he did a at least once or twice, I'm not sure how many times he did it, Judo inspired anthropometry performances where he and someone else would do judo throws while coated in blue paint and making impressions on a canvas, which I think is a much more sophisticated tribute to Klein than Bidlow's appropriation. Anyway, that's Yves Klein, the Provocateur. I recommend it. It's a good book. And I've written a lot about McEvely, so I will put a link to some of my other writing about him. And he's always worth reading. Thanks very much.